Welcome to the part 2 of chapter 1, the science of psychology. As you probably figured out, chapter 1 covers a broad topic of psychology, so it might feel a little overwhelming, but that's normal. And after chapter 1, it will get better as we focus on a consistent topic throughout the chapter. So in part 2, we will basically cover the fundamental of psychological research, including the steps that are used. We will also cover different techniques of conducting research, such as naturalistic and laboratory observation, case studies, survey, and pros and cons for these methods. We will also discuss correlational techniques when analyzing our data. Next, we will go over various concepts such as operational definitions, independent and dependent variables, and so on, and introduce you to how an experiment is carried out, and some of the issues we need to avoid, such as placebo and experimenter effect, and ways to avoid these issues. And last, we will go over the ethics in conducting research. And I know that sounds a lot, but as you watch this video clip, I would first try to understand the material, such as why there are advantages and disadvantages for a certain procedure, and the ways to minimize the certain problems, as opposed to memorizing the terminology. So in part 1 of the video, we discussed the 4 goals of psychology. The steps we discuss here is the specific steps that psychologists do to achieve some of these goals. So step 1 is observing some phenomenon in order to develop a research question. So this resembles the first goal of psychology, which was to describe what is happening. We need to know about the topic first to come up with a question. And step 2 is forming a hypothesis. So this resembles the second goal of psychology, which is to predict what will happen. And to check our prediction, we actually need to collect data and test it out, which is step number 3. And when we collect data, we really need to be specific what we are measuring. For example, say we want to know about more about aggressive behavior. But how would you define aggressive behavior? Are we going to focus on the physical aggression, or are we also going to include verbal aggression? And what do we do if an individual accidentally broke something? Do we count that as an aggressive behavior? So there are many things we need to think about to be consistent and be objective in how the construct, in this case aggressive behavior, is being measured or observed. And then in step 4, finally, we are able to draw a conclusion about our findings and typically report results publicly, and oftentimes in a scientific journal. And this is really important because to be considered as a scientific field, we want to know whether the findings are found consistently. And of course, if we conduct the same study in different countries, how individuals act may differ greatly, and that will be in important findings. But the important thing is to make our study available so that the other researchers, psychologists, are able to replicate the study and to advance the field. And the last step is to evaluate conclusion. Think about different ways to approach the question and to conduct another study again. So this is basically what the life of a researcher looks like. So if this sounds like the most exciting things you can imagine, let's have a chat. So there are many different ways to collect data. And one way is to observe animals or humans in their normal environment. As a result, this is called naturalistic observation. So if we are interested in examining how often children engage in aggressive behavior when they are playing with peers, we might go to a park and observe their behaviors. Because we are observing at their normal environment, we can get a pretty realistic picture of the behavior. However, naturalistic observation does have disadvantages. So imagine you are the child playing at the playground and there's an adult with a clipboard at the corner of the park watching you and the other kids play. That's a pretty weird situation and also scary if you think about it. So this is an example of observer effect. Once the children know that there's a person watching, they will behave differently, which defeats the whole purpose of naturalistic observation. Another method is the laboratory observation. So unlike the naturalistic observation, the researcher will observe animals or humans in a controlled laboratory settings. Because the observation will be done at the laboratory, the researcher has full control over the environment, such as the placement of the furniture, what kind of music to play, or even with the lightings. Also, researchers can use specialized equipment. For example, if you're interested in measuring brain waves, you can have the participant wear EEG devices on their head. So you got more flexibility in laboratory observation. And the third approach to collect data is using a case study. Case study stands out from the other method where a researcher only focuses on the one individual in great detail. And because of that, we get tremendous amount of detail about that individual. But at the same time, the finding from the case study may not be generalizable or applicable to others. So that could be listed as a disadvantage. So when do you think this is using case study is a good time? So the best time to use case study is when we want to learn a phenomena following a rare incident. For example, when a researcher wants to learn about a very rare medical disease, case study can be a very powerful approach. So one of the famous case study is a case from Phineas Gage, where he was a construction worker building railroads, tracks, and when they used explosive to get rid of huge rocks, a metal rod that was near came flying at him and penetrated his skull. And this was in 1800s when there were no advanced technology. But after conducting a case study on him, they found out that his personality changed dramatically, where people said he was no longer Gage. Through this study, researchers found out that the frontal lobe was associated with personality. Another method, and probably the most commonly used method in psychology, is surveys, whether that is done through paper and pencil or online. The huge advantage of using a survey is that it is easy to obtain data from a large number of people. If I ask you, all of you, to fill out a survey at this moment, I probably could easily collect close to 100 participants in a matter of minutes. Also, using a survey, we could measure covert activity fairly easily. So, do anyone remember what covert activities were? So it is basically things we cannot directly observe and see. And it includes, for example, symptoms of depression or anxiety. So by asking an individual how often they felt depressed or lost interest in the past week, we could measure their level of depression. But like any method, there are disadvantages. For example, people might not respond honestly, and as a result, the result may not be accurate. In addition, this isn't just for the survey method, and then probably going to apply for other methods, but researchers really need to ensure the participants are representative of the population we are interested in. So in other words, if a researcher is interested in knowing, for example, alcohol consumption among the all U.S. college students, but they only collect data from students who are enrolled in psychology courses in one single university, for example, in Texas, we certainly cannot provide meaningful summary regarding alcohol consumption among the whole U.S. college student. because our sample was not representative of US college students. So what becomes important is that all individuals in the population will need to be randomly sampled to ensure that our sample is representative of the population. So again, if we are interested in the alcohol consumption of the whole US college students, then every US college students will need to have an equal chance of participating in the research. But if you think about that, this is so difficult to do. So although random sampling is ideal, the majority of psychology studies do not use random sampling and instead may use convenience sampling, such as asking students enrolled in the psychology courses to participate in research. But if we were to do random sampling, again, we would just randomly pick participant from the population and include that in your sample. And based on your sample that you got, we could, again, make inferences, we could make summary, and say something about the population. So it is a very, very powerful method to use. So after we collect our data, one thing we could look at is what kind of relationship are there between two constructs or variables that were measured in the study. Variables are basically anything that can change or vary between participants. So our shoe size or height or levels of depression, they all can be considered a variable. And usually researchers measure multiple variables, and one thing we could do is to examine the relationship between the two variables. So for example, if we measured level of depression and amount of social support, we could test the relationship of these two variables. And specifically, we can test the direction and the strengths of the relationship. In terms of direction, there are three potential patterns. So there's a positive correlation, negative correlation, or zero correlation. In a positive correlation, if one increases, then the other also increase. So the more you study, the higher your test grade. In a negative correlation, if one increases, then the other decrease. So the more you party, the lower your test grade. Last is zero correlation or no correlation. Here, there are no relationship between the amount of milk you drink and your test grade. So this is an example of zero correlation. When expressing correlation, we can express in a single value which ranges from -1 to +1. By looking at the signs, either positive or negative, that indicates the direction of the relationship. In terms of the strengths of the relationship, if the value is closer to +1 or -1, the stronger the relationship between the two variables. And the correlation of 0 indicates zero correlation, so there's no correlation. So to find direction of the relationship, you focus on the sign. To find the strengths of the relationship, you focus on the values. However, one important thing to remember is just because you found a relationship between the two variables does not mean that you prove causation. For example, when a researcher examined the relationship between ice cream consumption and aggression, they actually found a positive correlation. But this does not mean eating ice cream will increase our aggression. If so, I would be pretty aggressive by now. So again, correlation does not prove causation. Rather, it was the heat that made people more aggressive. And because in a hot weather, people eat more ice cream, that was the reason why there was a positive correlation between eating ice cream and aggression. And occasionally, people would misinterpret these correlation or worse, intentionally take advantage of these statistical results to make it and use it to make an argument. And that is why we need to be an educated citizen to not fall in these traps, because it does happen quite a lot. Oh, and there's the sun, right? So it's the heat causing aggression, and not ice cream. All right. So is there a way to demonstrate causation? The answer is yes. We conduct an experiment. And just to be clear, the term experiment used in everyday language and the experiment used here is probably different. Here, we mean that there is a deliberate manipulation of a variable to see corresponding changes in behavior. Okay, that may not make sense right now, but know that a researcher intentionally controls or manipulate one variable, and we will go through an example later. And again, in any psychology research, it is important to think of an operational definition, which we covered in the first lecture or in one of the first slides today. Basically, we need to be really concrete in how we measure the variable, such as aggressive play, because it could include various type of aggressiveness, like verbal or physical. In an experiment, we need to distinguish the variables into two types, which are independent variable and dependent variable. Independent variable is the variable the researcher is able to manipulate. For example, let's say a researcher is interested in looking at the effect of watching violent TV on aggressive behavior. In this case, violent TV is the independent variable because the researcher is able to manipulate or control whether the participant will be watching the violent TV or not. The group that engages in an activity that the researcher is most interested, in this case the influence of watching violent TV, is called the experimental group. And the group where the participant will not engage in any activity, in this case not watching any TV, is called the control group. On the other hand, dependent variable is something that is dependent on the participant. And as a result, researcher is not able to manipulate or control. In other words, because whether or not the participant will play aggressively or not is up to the participant as opposed to the researcher, aggressive play will be the dependent variable in this example. Because the researcher has control over the independent variable, the researcher needs to find a way how to assign participant to either experimental or control group. When the researcher does this, it is very important to randomly assign participants to one of the groups. And it will be a very bad idea to place all males into experimental group and all females into control group. Why? Because if we do that, now we have no way of telling whether the difference of aggressive play is due to watching violent TV or is it due to difference in gender. By randomly assigning participants into experimental and control groups, we are basically controlling for the confounding variables, such as influence of gender and other characteristics that may influence the results. And also note that random assignment is not the same with random sampling, which sounds similar, but they are not the same. Random assignment is specifically about how to classify participants into different experimental groups, and it has nothing to do with sampling. So this is just an illustration of what we just talked about. If we are using random assignments, it will look like this. So just note that the participants are being classified randomly into experimental and control groups. And we basically test for differences In our example, we test the difference of aggressiveness. And if we do not use random assignment, this may happen. And here we have visualized the confounding variable, in this example, mood. Obviously, depending on one's mood, the likelihood of engaging in aggressive behavior would differ. And let's say that the participants were recruited from two classes, and one class just had a big exam, but because the researcher was too lazy to implement random assignments, the researcher told all participants from one class to be in the experimental group and to watch Vaughn TV. And because of this, all the participants in the experimental group is very tired. I think that's the angry face. Whereas the participant in the control groups are neutral. I think they're smiling. And if we assess for aggressive behavior and compare the results between these two groups, are the differences because of watching Vaughn TV or because of differences in mood? Because we did not use random assignment here, we have no way of separating the two, and we have just messed up the whole experiment for that reason. If we use random assignment, even when there are differences in the mood among participants, it should look like this. So basically, all the participants will have an equal chance of being assigned to either experimental or control group. And in this case, we are pretty confident of concluding that the differences in aggressive play is due to watching Vaughn TV. And in addition to random assignments, there are other effects that researchers need to be mindful of. So these effects are something we do not want. Placebo effect occurs when a participant expects something different will happen. For example, say a researcher is conducting an experiment to examine the effect of newly developed intervention. And when participants actually receive the intervention, they know that something would happen, and as a result, will influence their behavior. And because this effect is not related to the effect of the intervention itself, we want to minimize this placebo effect. So we can avoid this by using what's called a single blind study, where the researcher basically does not tell participants whether they are assigned to the experimental group or the control group. This way we can minimize participants' expectation influencing their behavior. Another way to minimize the placebo effect is to use placebo, which literally means a harmless substance with no physiological effect. And the use of placebo is to mimic the experience of the experimental group, but without providing the actual effect. And in psychology experiments, such as the previous example of examining the influence of watching Vaughn TV, we might actually add a placebo control group, where the participant in that group will watch a non-violent TV, but they still watch TV. This way, by comparing the aggressive behavior between the experimental group and the placebo control group, we are more confident that it is the violent content of the TV that increased the aggressive behavior as opposed to the experience of just watching a TV. Another effect we want to avoid is the experimenter effect. Unlike the placebo effect, which was initiated from the participants, the experimenter effect comes from the experimenter's expectation for a study to unintentionally influence the results. Obviously, this should be unintentional, because if there was a researcher who intentionally attempted to influence the result, then that is probably cheating and will be penalized by the affiliated institution. So hopefully there's no researcher who's trying to intentionally influence the results. Here's an example of the experimenter effect. So say that a researcher wanted to examine how long it takes for the rats to complete the maze, and the researcher tells the research assistants to do and to conduct the experiment and take the records of the time. And the researcher also told the assistants that there are two groups of rats, where one group of rats were found to be smarter than the other rats after doing some assessments. But this was a lie, and in fact, there were no differences between the two groups. But after the assistants did the experiment, they found out that the smart rat group completed the maze faster than not so smart rats. This is an example of experimenter effect. Because the assistants were told that one group of rats were smarter, they had an expectation about the outcome, and as a result, the assistant may have unintentionally stopped the stopwatch faster for the smart group rats. So to avoid this experimenter effect, we can use the double-blind study. In double-blind study, neither the experimenter nor the subject know which subject, in this case the rats, are in what group. But of course, someone needs to keep track of these groups, so usually the responsible researcher, usually a professor, will know the groups, but the research assistants who will be running the group do not know which participant or the rats are in experimental or control group. So when conducting a research study that involves human participants, researchers need to get an approval from the IRB, the Institutional Review Boards. And in university settings, there is an IRB in probably every institution where they do research. And the member of the IRB is a group of professionals who make sure that the research is being conducted in an ethical manner. And here are some of the ethical guidelines. As you participate in research conducted from PV, you always should be informed about the research and whether you would like to participate or not. And even if you say yes at that time and you begin the study but you want to stop, you could actually leave, stop at any time without any penalty. And the data that are being collected need to be remain confidential, and if not, then it should be explicitly stated and explained to you. So when you actually participate in research, make sure to read the informed consent page, which is often written in the beginning of the research. So that is it for chapter 1. And hope you learn about how psychology research is being conducted, and make sure to participate in the chapter 1 discussion through Canvas. Thanks and take care.